Detroit Speaks began in September of 2014 and is a series of lectures exploring the significance of Detroit's art schools and art education, museums and institutions, and galleries and artist-run spaces. It takes a closer look at the careers of individual Detroit artists. The talks will be conducted by a wide range of speakers, including artists, academics, curators, and educators, most of whom are based in Detroit. All Detroit Speaks talks will be published on the Detroit City website, which is part of mocadetroit.org. The speakers will come together later this year for the second roundtable discussion. We had one at the beginning of the series where the topic of discussion was, what is a Detroit artist? In the future, we'll host Cranbrook's Laura Mott on July 8th and Trinosof's Rebecca Matze on July 18th. Today, we are pleased to welcome Michael Stone Richards, professor in the Department of Liberal Arts at the College for Creative Studies, Detroit, where he teaches critical theory and visual studies. He has published widely in English and French on the history and critical theory of the avant-garde and contemporary art practices. He is also the founding editor of Detroit Research, a vital addition to the scholarship of post-studio practice in Detroit. In telling people about today's event, I encountered so many positive reactions. Michael Stone Richards' teaching and pedagogy has affected and improved the intellectual lives of so many. The consensus is that Michael Stone Richards is critical, not just in terms of scholarly activity, but critical in the sense of robustly engaging with and discussing matters of importance in culture today. And he's inspiring, too, to his students and to his colleagues. It's an honor for us to host him as part of the Detroit Speaks series. Let's welcome Michael Stone Richards for his talk, The Impossibility of Learning.
Thank you. Greg, thank you very, very much. I think many of you know, many of the people here today know that often descriptions of the speaker are written by the speaker. That was Greg, not me, okay? But I'm doubly grateful for that, and I'm exceedingly grateful for you turning out on such a wonderful day. The series of which my presentation today is a part is called What is a Detroit Artist? And in part, it started about 18 months ago when there were initially some discussions about doing a big exhibition at MoCAD on Detroit art. And without going into the details, it became quickly clear that such an exhibition was going to create some friends and many more enemies, right? Because there's far too much to get into the idea of what Detroit art is in one go. And I am exceedingly impressed and grateful that Alicia and her team came up with a completely different approach that said, what if we take a number of years, I believe 5 years, to try and explore in many different ways, in talks, presentations, seminars, exhibitions, large, small projects, what it might mean to say that there is something called a Detroit artist, not merely someone, as it were, who happens to live in Detroit. So I see this presentation as part of this ongoing investigation. More specifically, it's part of a book that I've been working on, or I should say research that I've been undertaking for the past 4 or 5 years on certain aspects of the contemporary art scene in Detroit, specifically in relation to national and international languages of art. It relates to a course that I've taught called Care of the City, Detroit, that is an introduction to social practice. And then more recently, a new course of only 2 years standing called Detroit, I Do Mind Dying, that some of you may know that is the blues song that is used in the film Finally Got the News from the about the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. And so this course was a pendant to my introduction to social practice that started to look what it would mean to look at Detroit culture through a black lens, intentionally leaving aside the Henry Ford and the industrial history. That is to say that there are many different kinds of history, and if we always start with the industrial history, everything else gets closed out. And so I use this as an opportunity to explore, by now, a very well-established approach called microhistory, where by asking questions that are not part of the grand narrative of history, we can get to a different set of concerns and a different set of issues. Now, coming back to the specific theme for today, pedagogy, art school pedagogy. And indeed, this relates to my overall arching concern in my book with social practice. Why art school pedagogy? I'm going to make a number of very bold claims, and I hope that they will be simple enough for us to unpack afterwards. And the way that I'm going to present this first is by showing a short set of slides, and then I'm going to turn off the slides, as it were, or ignore the slides, and then right at the end, there are a number of slides that I have prepared for a Q&A. The title of my talk today is The Impossibility of Learning Teaching. And the IM of im is closed off. It could be the possibility of learning or the impossibility of learning. When I was asked to give this talk, I was asked partly to give a history of the pedagogy in the metro area Detroit art schools. My colleague Jeffrey Apt, who sits there, who is in the audience today, knows more about that, I think, than most people. But my instinctive reaction was to say, that is of no interest to me. And this is my first very brutally plain point. It's of no interest to me in my work on what is contemporary art and what that might be in Detroit, for a very simple reason, that I don't think any of the art schools, without exception, and I'm like Jeffrey in his presentation in this series, I'm strategically leaving Cranbrook out of this for all kinds of reasons. I don't believe any of the local art schools has anything remotely like an innovative pedagogy. Not remotely. Indeed, if we want to know what is contributing to contemporary art from Detroit, we need to do one thing and one thing only, which is to look at the art that is being produced by artists in the city. Almost none of whom, I repeat, almost none of whom teaches in any permanent capacity in the local art schools, and very, very few of whom teach even in an adjunct capacity. But these are the artists who are known outside Detroit, be it Scott Hocking, be it Tyree Guyton, be it, say, Davos of the African Bead Museum and Sculpture Garden, be it Mitch Cope and Gina Reichert, be it Lynn Avadenka, printmaker, be it Susan Campbell, who I think is one of the artists doing some really compelling, interesting work on the relationship between artist research and art production. Or Mike Smith, who is no longer here, Kevin Beasley, who is no longer here, both of them graduates of CCS. There is, by no stretch of the imagination, can it be said that the art for which Detroit is becoming known outside Detroit is actually fully being represented within art school pedagogy. And in one sense, this is not a criticism of the colleges themselves, in one sense. There are other senses in which I think it manifestly is and has to be. The sense in which it's not a criticism is that the art schools are lagging behind. And in a way, they can't help it. By definition, institutional time is slower than existential time. Institutional time is slower than critical time. So in one sense, they can't help it. But the art school is founded on a kind of what I call a repressed, a set of contradictions, which I'm going to touch on towards the end of my presentation. The very foundation of the art school is a paradoxical phenomenon. And nowhere is this paradox of the foundation of the art school better expressed than when we research the history of the MFA program, of the MFA degree in the 1960s and 1970s, where and I will be reading a couple of substantial quotations later in my presentation, but I'm giving you an overview now. where it was said by all of the people formulating the MFA, including the Midwest College Art Association and the College Art Association in 1966, in 1977, and in its current policies, the MFA degree is not a degree for teaching. It is not a degree that is designed for artists to go and teach artists. About this, all professional organizations involved in the creation of the MFA are absolutely clear. Which leaves us, therefore, with the idea that in college, in university, we're being taught by people who don't necessarily know how to teach, right? And this is one of the paradoxes that I want to explore. But I also want to explore this in a philosophical way. And I'm going to start with my first set of slides and then go directly into the presentation. William, some of you from the generation of the Cass Corridor will know this image up on the screen. Art Isn't Anything from 1971, and it was the announcement by the artist William Antonow for his exhibition of recent works at the Willis Gallery in 1971. Art isn't anything. And common with in part of the logic of this statement, art isn't anything. And constantly what I'm interested in doing is linking art in Detroit with national and international languages of art. That is the single most important criterion for me. It is not to say that there isn't other kind of art, but the art that I'm researching, that I am writing about, trying to develop a critical theory about, is art that is decidedly part of a national or international language of art. And of course, the person who put this way of thinking about art, that art isn't anything, is in one sense, we could go back to Marcel Duchamp, but is in one sense the great German artist Joseph Beuys, who famously said, jeder Mensch ist ein Künstler. Everyone is an artist, right? And I want us to bear in mind this idea that art is fundamentally, in its contemporary late modern manifestation, not a question of technique or the teachability of technique. I want also to show two paintings from 1669. I'm sure most people recognize this as Rembrandt Self-Portrait, which is in the National Gallery in London. But that's not the reason that I'm showing it. I'm showing it to make a relatively simple but important philosophical point, that when your average person, in other words, not somebody who's been to college, not somebody who's done any art history, looks at a work like this, it doesn't occur to them to ask, what are they looking at? By which I don't mean, do they know who the sitter is? They know they're looking at a portrait. They will eventually learn that it belongs to the subgenre of portraiture, but they know what they're looking at. But when you look at a work like this, Picasso's The Accordionist from the Hermetic phase of Cubism in 1911, which is in the collection of the Guggenheim in New York, you cannot look at this work without asking at the same time, what am I looking at? Okay? Let me repeat. You don't ask, what am I looking at the Rembrandt. You begin to engage, you begin to respond, you begin to explore the degrees of your interest. But when we look at Hermetic work by Picasso, it is impossible not to ask, what am I looking at? And the question in this case, what am I looking at, is not merely an empirical question, i.e., if I do enough research, I will know that there is in fact a kind of portrait buried in this work, kind of, let me stress. No, it is not an empirical question, it's a philosophical question. In other words, within the art that we call modernism, the nature of what it is to look is built into the work itself. Let me repeat. The nature of what it is to look is built into the work itself. And certain strategies of resistance, certain strategies of representation are deployed to make us aware that part of the subject of the work is not a person, namely the person of whom this portrait may be an iconic image in the sense of Peirce's definition of the sign. Rather, this is something about the activity of looking. If a certain aspect of modern Western art is the philosophical dimension of what is built into the act of looking, there grows out of that reflexivity something else that is, in my way of thinking, not something that could have been born outside of the Western tradition, though because of the globalizing capacities of the Western tradition, that is to say, the powers that came with the formation of the early modern world, it's become a kind of universal thing. And that thing is to question what is art. To be able to question what is art, you need something both simple and complex. You need a frame. There is no other tradition that I'm aware of that has something comparable to the frame in Western art. The frame is something physical. The frame is something aesthetic. What is inside is a work of art. What is outside is not. But it's also something conceptual. That is to say, the set of procedures and knowledges by which we're able to say something is a work of art, i.e., art school, galleries, museums. These are part of the larger conceptual frame. I cannot tell you how many students, when they come to art school in the freshman year, it's really rather impressive how many students know exactly what art is and what it is not. It is very, very impressive. And they know that Duchamp's urinal is not art. And they know that performance art is not art. And there's a ton of stuff they know. And then by their senior year, they're doing these little things in corners that nobody can see unless they're pointed out. And in at least one case I know, at graduation, the poor student was in tears because her parents wondered what they'd spent their money on, right? The question of the frame is part of the very definition of Western art, and thereby what is outside the frame, the tension, the tension with what is outside the frame is built into that. And one of the ways in which the tension is built into that, all learning involves imitation. All learning involves imitation. But imitation is also something that we can lose control of. Again, Plato and Aristotle are absolutely key here. In Plato's philosophy of art as developed in the Republic, i.e. his principal work of a kind of imaginative political philosophy, what are the conditions? He does not say for the perfect society. He says, what are the conditions for the well-ordered society? Education is a key part of that. And a key part of illustrating the possibilities of education is through art. And it's there, I think, that we often misunderstand what Plato's real criticism of art is. Plato is aware that art occupies a zone between the strictly rational and the strictly irrational. And in that zone, it draws upon the powers of imitative capacity. And Plato thought that the imitative capacities were inherently dangerous and had to be contained, right? And in this, Plato is absolutely right. Imitation is the source of some of the most horrific forms of human violence that we have. It's there in fashion. It's there in people buying Beanie Babies. It's there in people doing the Macarena. But it's also the same phenomenon that is involved in lynching, right? And it's the same phenomenon that is involved in war. We can all start a war, but why do we not end wars? Partly it's a question of honor, of saving face. But it is also, of course, that imitative behavior soon runs out of control. Aristotle, on the other hand, said, that may be so, but human beings cannot learn without imitation. Therefore, the Aristotelian approach to the phenomenon of imitation is to say, we must learn what it means to occupy the juste milieu, not the juste milieu, the just or golden mean, right? We must draw upon these powers, but we must also be disciplined to learn, to contain, to constrain, and to challenge these capacities. So I want to bring up the question of imitation because that is involved in the relationship between a very great artist who came from Detroit, James Lee Byers, whom you see on the left, the cloth around his head, with Joseph Beuys in 1983. In 1983, at the opening of the Speck collection in Hamburg, there's a whole series of works that Byers does in relation to Beuys, imitating Beuys. Here is Beuys in Berlin in 1965 doing an action of sweeping. Here is Byers in 1983 at the Met in New York doing a sweeping action. Imitation, repetition are the sources of learning. But I also think that Byers is doing something very interesting in these head coverings of photographs that he staged with Beuys in Germany, which is to say, pointing to the necessity of also breaking the imitative link. On the one hand, his own actions that are clearly and demonstrably based upon imitating Beuys's actions, and yet at the same time, when he comes face to face with Beuys, he stages a confrontation with Beuys, an encounter, rather, with Beuys, where that imitative link, i.e. by breaking the link to vision, that imitative link is broken. But what I'm also pointing to in this challenge to the imitative link, to this breaking of the imitative link, or at least making the imitative link a subject, is that all of this is in relation to the frame, and in relation to what is or is not outside the frame, whereby almost any kind of action, and that is the German word that was used in the 1960s for what we now call performance art. The term that was used in New York at the same time was happenings. Performance has now taken over everything. But the actions only make sense in relation to a frame. Let me try and put this in another way. If somebody who had never studied art history in their life were to find the Rembrandt Self-Portrait I showed earlier in the middle of Woodward, that person would know that they were looking, could reasonably be expected to know that they were looking at a painting. And thereby, what they just chanced upon as a painting was also a work of art. On the other hand, no one was to find a urinoir, that, you know, the thing that gentlemen piss into in the gentleman's room. No one who found such a thing in the middle of Woodward would it ever occur to them that they might have found something that was a work of art, right? It wouldn't occur to anyone, right? They would say, oh, somebody threw, you know, they throw away strange stuff in the middle of Woodward in Detroit, don't they? But they wouldn't say, oh, the DIA, MOCAD, is missing one of the most seminal works of art of the 20th century, right? No. And the reason for that is because the urinal and works like this can only be considered works of art in relation to the frame. That is to say, in relation to the museum, in relation to the gallery. Whatever the space is that activates a set of knowledges and beliefs on the part of the viewer, that is the frame. And this is not a work of art unless it's in relation to the Met. It's not a work of art unless it's in relation to some aspect of the frame. And we have moved beyond that frame. And as we have moved beyond that frame, it is not an accident that Beuys should have said that the most important form of art in which he was involved, the most important form of art in which he was involved, was teaching. Claire Bishop, in her recent, still relatively recent book, Artificial Hells, on the genealogical history of social practice, says in her final chapter called Pedagogic Projects, right? This is the chapter in which she looks at the increasing, prevalent, extraordinarily important practices of teaching as an art practice. And she begins by saying that this was the most difficult chapter for her to write, partly as a scholar-teacher, university scholar-teacher, but also the most troubling, the most problematic. She says, art, after all, is given to be seen by others, while education has no image. I must confess that I find that an astonishing statement at one level for a modernist, because we have many, many images within the Western tradition. Pound gave us the idea derived from the Greeks of the paiduma. Almost every work of Greek classical sculpture is an image of education. And within modernism, within the iconography of Max Ernst, within the novels of Alain Fournier, within someone like a Korean-American writer, artist such as Teresa Cha, the classroom is a foundational aspect of the acquisition not only of knowledge, but of artistic practices in the transmission. But nevertheless, she says, art is given to be seen by others while education has no image. Viewers are not students, and students are not viewers. She says, the artist more than any other to whom all refer in this insurgence of pedagogical practice, and she's quite right in this, is Joseph Beuys. And so Beuys put at the center of his practice the idea of teaching. She asks, what does it mean to do education as art? What does it mean to do education as art? How do we judge these experiences? And I want to suggest in part that the response to that question is not impossible or even that difficult, but at least it's no more impossible or difficult than the question of what is art. Because let's bear in mind, to repeat something I said earlier in my presentation, alluding to Plato's political philosophy, the Republic, and the role of art. In just about every major work of comprehensive political philosophy, there is a place, what is going to be the role of education, right? Whether we go from Plato to Dewey doesn't matter. What is going to be the role of education? And nearly always, art is taken as the exemplar of what it might mean to educate. And what I'd like to suggest in response to Claire Bishop is that education, pedagogy, and art absolutely do go together, because in fact what we're going to see is that art is a certain kind of aporia, that is a certain kind of perplexing phenomenon, and to teach it is equally perplexing, but not for the reasons that people may have thought. So Beuys makes teaching his work of art. In a famous interview in Art Forum from 1969, he's asked by the American artist Willoughby Sharp, has your teaching at the Dusseldorf Art Academy for the last 8 years been an important function for you? Beuys, it is my most important function. To be a teacher is my greatest work of art. Let me repeat. It's my most important function. To be a teacher is my greatest work of art. The rest is the waste product, a demonstration. If you want to explain yourself, you must present something tangible. But after a while, this has only the function of a historic document. And then he goes on to say, which helps us to understand where we are in late modern art, he goes on to say, objects are not very important for me anymore. Objects are not very important for me anymore. Why is that? And what is Beuys doing when he says objects are not important for me anymore? These photographs of Beuys at the blackboard, i.e. Beuys teaching, are from 1974 at the Art Institute in Chicago. Likewise, okay, this one seems to be dead. There. Likewise, sorry. So both of these photographs are from Beuys teaching at the Art Institute, and from a very famous performance, one of his most famous performances actions from 1965, How to Explain Pictures to a Dead Hare. We are well beyond the pictorial frame. However, the performance takes place within a gallery, right? So the gallery, we are still within the frame and what it might mean to push the edges of the frame. Why teaching? I'm going to go through some things very quickly and then try and pull some sections together. Voice, thought, speech, communication are all experiences of the free human being. Thought, speech, communication are all experiences of the free human being. I want to suggest the following. In the developing practices from the 1960s, Boyce, Guy Debord, the great work of philosophy of education by Paulo Freire from 1968, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which has become, again, with the advent of social practice, a seminal work all over again. So Boyce, Guy Debord, Paulo Freire, social practice. The key term is dialogue. They all have a lot to say about dialogue. And the key point about dialogue, and they each have very specific concepts of dialogue, and the chapter from this work, which this presentation is drawn, I'm particularly interested in putting Guy Debord and Paulo Freire in dialogue. The key point here is that dialogue is understood to be the supreme expression of human freedom. And human freedom, going back to the work of Schiller, is the singular purpose of art. The singular purpose of art is to enhance and maximize the capacities and moments of the experience of freedom. Paulo Freire, in his Pedagogy of the Oppressed, encapsulates this in his concept of pedagogical action. And when Freire talks about the oppressed, today in social practice, the term that replaces the oppressed is the student. Pedagogical action is action with, not to, but with, of which the image and the medium, that is the image of pedagogical action, is dialogue. Quote, the correct method of liberation, and I want to maintain the word liberation, liberty, not just freedom. The correct method of liberation lies in dialogue, he says. And then he adds, attempting to liberate the oppressed without their reflective participation in the act of liberation is to treat them as objects. Liberation is in part, in other words, necessarily self-liberation. We cannot liberate another. We cannot liberate another group. By the way, this is an insight from Plato to Simone Weil in the 1930s and early 40s that is quite commonplace. Only a people can liberate themselves. I wish that our presidents would understand this. Only a people can liberate themselves, and only an individual can initiate the beginning of self-liberation, of self-liberation. Guy Debord, in a famous piece from 1966 called The Ideology of Dialogue, says the model of what is called, gives a model of what he calls the reality of dialogue against the many variants of false dialogue. And what would the model? It would be like a conversation, right? A conversation is open. It is non-hierarchical. And whatever emerges out of the conversation is something that is communally created, or what Debord calls a common project, which is only possible, he says, on the assumption of self-discipline, l'autodiscipline, on self-discipline of the participating individuals within a free association of individuals. This is Debord's image of education. And I want to say, whether it's Boyce, whether it's Guy Debord or Paulo Freire, it is absolutely Socratic. And in a moment, I'll also come to Jacques Rancière. It is absolutely Socratic, or at least the idea of Socrates that comes down to us in Plato's work. Jacob Klein wrote a very famous commentary on Plato's Meno, M-E-N-O, in which he says a Platonic dialogue is a whole in itself. The almost indispensable pattern of its form is precisely the dialogic clothing. Its intent is to imitate oral instruction. And then, quoting the great German classicist Paul Friedländer from 1958, he says, "The dialogue is the only form of book that seems to suspend the book form itself." The dialogue is the only form of book that seems to suspend the book form itself. In other words, dialogical practice interrupts and deflects established institutional patterns. It interrupts and deflects established institutional patterns. Because the person who is learning, and I'm going to complicate what that means in a moment, must also be their own teacher, right? Paulo Freire, in a famous chapter in the Pedagogy of the Oppressed, refers to traditional forms of instruction as the banking method, right? I, the teacher, the instructor, have something to put in the empty head of somebody called a student, like putting money in a bank, right? And they will only be said to have learned if they can repeat back to me exactly what it is that I put into their empty heads. What I would also like to say about this emphasis on dialogue and the relationship to freedom, that it is only in dialogue that we can realize a certain type of freedom, and that since the Schiller of the Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Man, the experience of freedom, the experience of liberty, has been, in fact, within the Western tradition, from the Romanticism right through to Surrealism, Dada, Surrealism, and the various movements of the 60s, has been the principal aim of art. The great German scholar Karl Löwith captured this because it's a profoundly young Hegelian idea. That is to say, the young disciples around Hegel, be it Feuerbach, be it Bruno Bauer, and of course somebody called Karl Marx. The young Karl Marx begins as a young Hegelian. And Karl Löwith wrote, "Only through communication, only through the conversation of man with man do ideas arise." And if this is the only way that ideas arise, what he's saying is that this is what it means to be creative. Jacques Rancière, in The Ignorant Master, Le Maître Ignorant, thinks he is going beyond Socrates, but in fact he's not. And Freire implicitly, Paulo Freire, implicitly, I'm going to suggest, is referring to Socrates, the Socrates of the Meno. Here is what Paulo Freire writes. The central problem is this: how can the oppressed, as divided, inauthentic beings, participate in developing the pedagogy of their liberation? His answer: only as they discover themselves to be the host of the oppressor can they contribute to the midwifery of their liberating pedagogy. He's saying, in other words, freedom is not a given. Freedom does not come merely from the outside, but from others. And he concludes, liberation is thus a childbirth, and a painful one. The man or woman who emerges is a new person. Ladies and gentlemen, this is pure Socrates. And I'm going to give, in a summary version, what Socrates says, the argument of Socrates in the Meno. M-E-N-O. Meno is a disciple of Socrates, and he meets Socrates, and Meno comes along with his servant, and that is important, and initiates a conversation, a Socratic dialogue with Socrates. And the question is, can virtue be taught? But the question is not uniquely a question about virtue, because here the Greek word arete stands in for any kind of skill. Later on, it will be, can truth be taught? And they have a to and fro, a back and forth. And Socrates says, you know, this is a really interesting problem, because if virtue could be taught, presumably fathers would have virtuous sons, right? And we all know that there are virtuous fathers who have done all that could reasonably be expected of them, and their sons are not virtuous. We know that there are virtuous politicians who have mentored, taught politicians who turn out to be corrupt and utterly unworthy. So what are they doing? What are they doing if not trying to teach virtue? And after a series of back and forth, Socrates says, you know, this is not just about a particular instance of virtue. They go on to discuss beauty, truth, mathematics, memory, and so on. What is memory? What is knowledge? And then Socrates turns the question back on Meno, and Socrates said, by the way, I'm not sure that I can teach you what virtue is, but virtue just stands in for teaching. I'm not sure that I can teach you. Oh, and by the way, I'm not sure that you can learn either, right? There's the aporia, there is the perplexity, there is the paradox. I am not sure that I can teach you, and I am not sure that you can learn. And then Socrates says, the best that I can be, and this is one of the most famous gendered images in all of Plato's work, and it occurs in two places, the Meno and the Theaetetus. The best that I can be is to be a midwife to ideas, right? There is something that is already in you. I may or may not be able to help it to come out. You may or may not yourself be able to get it out, but that is the best that I can be. And here, then Socrates makes another distinction, because in early Plato's work, there was a radical distinction between knowledge, skill that can be repeated, and inspiration, which in the Ion, which is the earliest work of Plato on art, inspiration is deemed to be irrational. And it is irrational because the opposite of inspiration, knowledge, episteme, is that which can be repeated at will. What does it mean to learn? It means to have mastered something that one can then repeat at will. That is in the early work. Inspiration is the opposite of knowledge. In this work, and this is a distinction that works throughout Plato until the Meno, and Socrates now makes another distinction between science and reason. Science is what is a set of techniques that can be learned and that can be repeated with certainty, with definable and anticipatable results. Reason, however, is not like that. And what Socrates goes on to say is that we're dealing with a form of experience that is neither, strictly speaking, scientific and not, strictly speaking, irrational. And this is why it is exceedingly difficult to know how things like virtue, things like beauty, things like truth, things like art can be taught. We know, however, that they can be transmitted, but they cannot be taught if what to teach means is to have a readily available set of techniques that can be mastered and then reproduced. So, if then art, virtue, truth, beauty, the things that matter, as Virginia Woolf, to use a phrase of Virginia Woolf, cannot be taught in the scientific sense, what are we doing? I'm going to use a very old-fashioned language, and I want you to bear with me. Socrates says, this is something to do with transmission. And here, the tension is between what it is to transmit and what it is to learn. Certain things can be transmitted between a master and a disciple. Bear with me, this is not current language. And Socrates has a remarkable passage where he says, a master who does not have disciples has nothing to teach. What the master has to teach has no future. He doesn't say that person is not intelligent, that person doesn't have something. What he's saying is, if you do not have any disciples, whatever it is that you have to teach has no future. Think about the many artists, the many schools of philosophy, religions that have their efflorescence and then die out, right? Once upon a time, at the end of the 19th century, and in America well into the 20th century, the dominant pictorial language of Western Europe, at least for advanced painting, was Impressionism. I want to suggest that there was something to transmit in Impressionist painting, something that poets, critics, writers, and subsequently art historians have, in their way, struggled to define, struggled to gain access to. And then and there were lots of imitators. And here I want to say that the word imitators is not a bad thing. You could go into any major American museum and find more than enough examples of American form Impressionism. And then there is a moment when you cannot. It's over. Whatever it is that Impressionism had to convey, whatever it is that is in the language that I'm using, it had to transmit, was no longer not only transmissible, but was no longer receivable. Because after all, and art schools around us, all schools, but particularly art schools, are filled with these kinds of examples, i.e. people who came of age at a certain moment and can't understand why their students are not interested in what it is they have to teach. And we blame all kinds of things. We blame the public school education. We blame TV. We blame the internet. You name it. The iPhone. But in fact, it's to do with the idea that certain notions, certain ideas are no longer receivable. Because how those ideas were transmitted, and I mean by that what was important in those ideas, was not through a reproducible set of techniques. It was through the master-disciple relationship. And what is the master-disciple relationship? And this is why I've said I want you to bear with me. Transference. Why Socrates? And we could come forward to Freud and psychoanalysis, Jacques Lacan and psychoanalysis, André Breton and the Surrealists, Virginia Woolf and the friends around the group around Bloomsbury. We could come to abstract paint. You take your pick. You take your choice. It's up to you, right? Transference is when an emotional attachment is established between two people, people and things, a people and a group. Indeed, there is a text by the Lacanian school called L'amour de l'école, love of the school, right? Maurice Blanchot always spoke, when he wrote about surrealism, always spoke about what he called the third, le tiers, that surrealism is not merely what the individual poets, writers, filmmakers, painters of the Surrealist movement make. Surrealism is something apart from the group. He called it always in the third. And as it were, one gives one's attraction to surrealism, right? I'm trying to suggest a certain type of value can only be transmitted transferentially. And that when the transferential relationship breaks down, the ideas that once were the basis of that are no longer receivable. Okay? They're no longer receivable. And we spend a lot of time trying to think, how can we make people appreciate? You know, is it our branding? Is it our advertising? What is it that we need to do? And there are cases in which, of course, if nobody knows about you, how can they learn what you have to offer? But in fact, in the context of a school, everybody knows what it is that you have to offer, and it means nothing. It's dead, in other words. This is what Aristotle, the point of Socrates' example, when he says that certain kinds of ideas that are not strictly scientific and not strictly irrational can only be transmitted from master to disciple. And what is the mark of this? It's so interesting. He uses exactly the same word, or rather, Paulo Freire uses exactly the same word as Socrates. When we feel that we're in possession of a special kind of knowledge, we feel converted. This is pre-Christian. We feel converted. We feel, as the passage I gave you from Freire said, that we are a new person, that we have been, in some way, born a different person. Henry James does this in his great novel of aestheticism and terrorism, The Princess Casamassima. But Socrates is saying, when we are in possession of a new kind of knowledge, it allows us to see the world in a completely different way. We feel that we have the key to understanding the world. Imagine the first time that somebody decides, I'm a Marxist. I understand how the modern world is produced. Imagine, that is a feeling of conversion. Imagine the moment that you suddenly feel, I'm a poet, and it's true, it's real, I know what is involved, and I know what it means. You see the world in a different way. When we look at the great artists who originated abstraction, the Czech Kupka, the Russian, Austrian Kandinsky, the Polish, Russian, Lithuanian Malevich, the Dutch Mondrian, they are all of them, without exception, deeply impacted by Hermetic views. And they all of them regard abstraction as a form of modern spirituality, right? As a form of modern spirituality, because this now was a knowledge that allowed us, it was not about pretty pictures, it was a knowledge that allowed us to see the world in a different way. The point that I'm making is, the moment that one feels oneself in the possession of a new language, one sees the world in a different way. Indeed, Socrates quotes from the Odyssey, from the Iliad, a remarkable passage, I won't quote it, it's much too long, where he says, it would be like the passage where Homer depicts Tiresias in the land of the ghosts. That is to say, the land of the dead, right? And of course, this is a standard trope in all forms of religious thought. I once was blind, but now I'm found, right? Amazing grace, etc. But we have that without being religious. We have that every time we feel that we have an insight that makes a difference to our life. Now imagine that insight at the level of something that can be transmitted to a group beyond yourself, and which in turn can be codified. That is what Socrates is talking about. And I'm going to miss out a section on Foucault as I move towards my conclusion. Foucault, in his late work on the care of the self, is doing something similar, I think, as well. He has, again, a remarkable expression about the parts of the self that escape the purely cognitive, rational parts of the self, what he characterizes as the sandy stretches of non-thought. We are only fully human if we can integrate the sandy stretches of non-thought, l'impensé in French, with the cognitive parts of ourselves. The French political philosopher Marcel Gauchet wrote a book with some colleagues last year, came out last year, called Transmettre, Apprendre, transmission, transmitting, learning. And he begins by saying, in fact, we hardly know what it means to learn. Nous disposons que de très faibles lumières. We have available to us very weak light on what it is to learn. But he says learning is not knowing. And his argument, which underpins my presentation as I move towards a conclusion, and then in the discussion, I have a number of slides that I want to bring up, depending where the discussion goes. His structure is this. He says, the classical ideal of learning has always been the transmission of something. It's always been transmission. The modern idea of learning, and being a Frenchman, the modern for him, his example of the modern is going to come from René Descartes in the 17th century, the discourse on method. The modern idea of learning is not, he says, based upon the transmission of knowledge, but upon method, right? Method. It is only if we can state a method, follow a method, are we in a position to judge the efficacy of that method. And as the modern world develops from the 17th century onwards, method has become more and more important. And method has generated bureaucracy. Method, whether you're in an art school or a university, and by the way, I don't mean to sound here critical, method has become what we now call in college learning outcomes. Method is what is codifiable. And Gaucher's point is that for much of the modern period, there has existed a tension between the idea of knowledge as learning as transmission and learning as method. But as we come into the late modern period, method is winning out, and the idea of transmission is becoming more and more obsolete. He quotes the German philosopher Gerhard de Haan, who wrote a book called Die Zeit in der Pädagogik, Time in Pedagogy. We are living, he says, nous vivons, we are living, we are passing through the end, because this is what transmission is, the end of the education of the young generation by the generation that precedes it. Let me repeat. We are living, passing through the end of the education of the young generation by the generation that precedes it and which has been there since the beginning. This tension between transmission and method has been repressed by the whole enterprise of art teaching, of institutionalizing art teaching. Because I'm arguing that the very existence of art schools is based upon a set of unworked out, unresolved contradictions that are now coming home to roost. This is the repressed of the enterprise of art teaching, or of institutionalizing art teaching within the college or the university. Howard Singer, himself an artist but also a scholar, Howard Singerman, his book, Art Subjects, Making Artists in the American University, from 1999, makes illuminating and depressing reading, especially the chapter on the creation and institutionalization of the MFA and the contradictions inherent, namely that the MFA was never meant to be and was agreed that it could not be a teaching degree, yet the MFA, is the requirement, that is a terminal degree, for college-level art teaching, whence we are taught art making by people who cannot teach or who cannot verifiably teach. Let me quote from Howard Singerman. He speaks of a man called Adler, who was one of the important people in the development of the MFA. Like many, Adler located the market for the MFA in college or university-level art education, as did a resolution approved by the 1959 Midwest College Art Association Conference, which recommended that the MFA, quote, be considered the terminal degree for teachers of studio courses. The College Art Association, that is the national body, adopted this recommendation at its annual meeting in 1960. But the College Art Association's report on the status of the degree in 1965 included the caveat, the warning, that although holders of the MFA use the degree, quote, in large part as an entry into the teaching field, it is evidently not generally designed in a specific way to prepare the student for this. By 1977, the year the College Art Association current guidelines were adopted, the MFA was explicitly not a teaching degree. Rather, it guarantees that one is, or at the very least, has the ability to be, an artist. Currently, according to the College Art Association, the MFA is to be used, quote, is to be used as a guarantee of a high level of professional competence in the visual arts. It promises not only a certifiable level of technical proficiency, but also, and without equivocation, the ability to make art. The guidelines hedge, and the degree cannot certify teaching. Quote, having earned the degree does not necessarily guarantee an ability to teach this proficiency to others. That is the very foundation of the MFA. In other words, the main institutional mechanism for giving us, the people who teach art in art schools, has never been able to decide what it is to teach. And hence we get, I think, this sad spectacle of the idea of spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to go to an art school to learn what? To learn techniques. To learn techniques. And then when you leave that school, what do you discover? The College Art Association gives us the figures. Within 5 years of graduating, 85% of art school graduates cease to self-identify as artists. I repeat, they cease to identify as artists. If you look at American colleges and universities that teach humanities, almost without exception, the largest department is the history department, followed not far behind by the English department. I've never been in a context where those history students were taught or had the expectations you're going to become historians. I went to college where many of my friends studied classical Greek, classical Latin, Persian, Mandarin, or philosophy. No one ever said to us or gave us the slightest inkling, oh, you know what, we're teaching you to go teach Persian, Greek, Latin, Mandarin, or to become philosophers. No one. As far as I'm aware within the humanities, it is unique to art schools that they allow the circulation of this myth that you go to art school to become an artist. I find this inherently absurd, and I find it destructive. I didn't go to college to study philosophy to become a philosopher. None of my friends who studied classical Greek, not true. I have one friend who studied classical Latin and went on to become a college-level teacher of Latin. I have 3 or 4 friends who studied classical Greek and went on to become teachers of classical Greek. But that's out of hundreds, right? And as far as I'm aware, they're gainfully employed, right? Where I'm going with this is that we're approaching a crisis in art school education. The president of my college, who I think is putting a lot of thought to this, knows the statistics. It is fairly well documented that within the next 10 to 15 years, there's going to be a falling off in the number of students going to college. Within Michigan, it is expected that there will be at least a 9% reduction in the overall population of students going to college. Therefore, art schools are going to have to ask themselves, how can we justify the money that we are asking, right? Those of you who are interested in some of these questions, there is a group, a very interesting group called BFA, MFA, PhD. You can find them online. That my wife and I went to an exhibition in Cleveland called the $120,000 art degree, right? Which was a critical exploration of the cost of an art degree and what it is that one gets for it. And of course, the answer in some respects is not a lot. In some respects. If you went in with the ambition or the implicit understanding that you may or may not have a reasonable chance of becoming an artist. The response is not to close art schools, though of course that is going to happen because it's exceedingly difficult to change certain habits. The response is not to close art schools. The response is to become clear again, if possible, about what it means to learn. And just as people go to college to study Greek, philosophy, history, or English, without the expectation that they will become professionals in those disciplines, we need to be able to say that the function of an art school is to provide an education, right? That happens to work through art. That is why, in this country, without exception, every art school has a liberal arts component, right? Whether they're up to it or not is entirely another question. But it may be too late, because the argument that I'm exploring is that in this tension between transmission and method, method is winning out, and that the only way that colleges going forward will be able to justify to the people who pay this money, namely first and foremost parents and then the students themselves, is by giving them something that is demonstrable. Art is not demonstrable in that sense, and I don't want to advocate some airy-fairy idea of what is unquantifiable, it's all spiritual. That's not what I'm interested in. I'm saying that there is a larger set of forces at work that will push us in the direction of the thing that is quantifiable, and that is to say, digital education, digital technology. And more, we are going to see the idea of the fine arts squeezed out because we have not been able to formulate an adequate account of what it means to learn and of what it is that we are trying to transmit. It makes no sense to me to say that we're trying to transmit a set of techniques. That is not why anyone goes to college. But what will take its place, I'm not entirely sure either. Within Detroit, I see these tensions being worked out. That is why I started my presentation by saying there is, and I don't think this is very controversial, there is no innovative technology within any of the art schools that I'm aware of, but there is within the art being produced in Detroit. Be it social practice, be it installation art, be it post-studio art. I think of an artist like Susan Gertel Campbell, whose work, along with Scott Hocking, two of the artists who have developed a very interesting way of addressing the relationship between artist research and the creation of a new kind of art that is the result of that artist research. I look also at Tyre Guyton's Heidelberg project. I look also at Davos African Bead Museum. These are the things, ladies and gentlemen, that are known outside Detroit by the international art community. And I'm suggesting that that's where we need to go to begin to think about what an innovative pedagogy might be within the framework of art. Because finally, pedagogy is not a set of recipes for effective teaching in the classroom. Pedagogy is fundamentally, and only possible, it is fundamentally a question of what is it that we want to transmit? What is it? And if we cannot answer the question, what it is that we seek to transmit, we don't stand a chance. There is a chance, I believe, if we look at the variety of practices emerging within the city of Detroit. I believe that is where innovation lies, in the sense that I would use the word innovation. Thank you very much. And love to take some questions if there are any. George. Yes. Jacques Rancière wrote a book, The Ignorant Master, where he wants to make an argument that I find quite convincing, that learning begins with self-authorization, right? I don't learn because somebody tells me something. I learn because it's part of what it is to be self-aware and to develop. And he thinks that Socrates, the Socratic method, is the exact opposite of that. That the Socratic method is when Socrates drawing up on what's called the theory of recollection, the idea that we have a knowledge in us that can be brought out in the right circumstances. Socrates asks certain kinds of questions, interrogates his subject, and by leading set of questions brings out the answer that he, Socrates, wants to be brought out. I think that is a hackneyed way of thinking about the Socratic method, and most of the scholars that I would use to help me with the reading of Plato and Socrates are very clear that for Socrates, this is a process of self-awareness. One of our leading classicists, M.F. Bernide, just to quote, it's a simple passage, "Self-knowledge is not only the goal of Socratic education, it is also, right from the beginning, a vital force in the processes itself, which involves and is sustained by the pupil's growing awareness." That is what I think that is the core of. I don't think that radically differs from what Jacques Rancière is trying to do. And then some of the new practices of pedagogy coming out of social practice, I'm trying to say that they have a grounding within a Socratic conception of what it means to learn. Yes, and I think that's what I'm doing. That's hence I say that, you know, Socrates, when you learn something new, when you have an insight, you feel that you're a different person. That's passion. That is the passion. Correct, I agree. I absolutely agree, sorry. Is somebody at the back there? Did you want to ask a question? Okay, no. Any other questions, please? Jessica. Is there another microphone by the slightest chance? You need to shout. You need to make sure people back there can hear as well. Shout. Okay. Okay, go ahead, Jessica, and I'll try and restate the question. No, sorry, my apologies. Right. So the question is, if I were to drop the pretense of being an expert on a subject, would that open up some new possibilities? Yes, and I believe that the tradition that I'm appealing to, up to and including contemporary approaches to pedagogical art, be it within post-studio social practice frameworks, that is precisely the goal, because the goal then is to say that learning is a function of co-authorship. Learning is co-authorship. So if I know more about something than you perspective, you have nothing to teach me, right? I'm saying that's a purely technical thing. We're not going to argue about that. But the argument might be, what is the cultural significance of perspective within the Western tradition? Then I can learn from you, because then we're both, as it were, in the process of co-authorship of our knowledge. Right. So Jessica's making the point, therefore, it's a theory of knowledge where no one owns the knowledge. That's absolutely right, because the knowledge is something that is produced through cooperation. It's produced, knowledge now is the common, what Guy Debord called the common project, right? The common project. And by the way, I think this takes place ordinarily. This is not a special plea. I'm making a plea that we need to drop some antiquated methods of learning that were formulated on principles in the 1950s and 60s that were not fully worked out. But we do this all the time when we learn from one another and learn with one another and learn through one another. And I believe that this is a model that is going to come about. The irony is that just as art schools are becoming more and more technologically driven, the irony is that this model of shared research, shared participation, and experimentation is already available in the tech world, right? But we don't think of using, we want to use that for digitally related things, but for whatever reason, we don't do that in relation to the fine arts. And I'm saying that actually, before it's too late, that's what we need to think about doing. Yes. Well, oh, sorry, yes. Marcia. Thank you. Thanks, it's very generous. Right. Marcia, that's a really superb question. Do I think that the problems I'm talking about are linked to a particular economic system that came into existence at the time of the young Hegelians in the 19th century? The answer to that is yes. But let me give it in a slightly different way. The answer is yes. But in some ways, ladies and gentlemen, we are the victims. We, meaning I'm only speaking about the Western world, we are the victims of our own success. One of the narratives of the Western world in the last 200 years has been the narrative of increasing democratization, right? We all know that that also depended upon the exploitation of others and others' resources. But be it workers, be it women, there has been a process of increasing democratization which gathered speed in the 20th century, and particularly after the Second World War. With the success of the democratization, more people were interested in participating in art making and art appreciation than at any time in human history. But the success of democratization has also led to, very likely, an irreversible fragmentation in the audience for art. So that if one thinks of how many of the great art institutions of America in the 20th century were founded, the museums where the rich bequeath their collections, the role of Rockefeller in the creation of the NEA, the NEH, and so forth. In England, the Arts Council, where I come from, where John Maynard Keynes was one of the movers behind the scenes of that. This was all predicated on a hierarchical notion that art was good for you, right? It was good for you, and art should be made accessible through museums, and art should be made accessible in schools. And it was good that, say, blue-collar people would have the opportunity not only to appreciate art, but even become artists. In this very building 2 years ago at the Art X, I was on a panel with Gunnar Nadarajan, the new dean of the Penny Stamps School, and Tom Birding, chair of Fine Arts and Design at MSU. And Tom Birding gave a really, really interesting response to some of these questions, saying, I, Tom Birding, come from a blue-collar background. My sisters and I were able to receive a high-quality education without needing to go to Ivy League, and I, Tom Birding, could end up as not only an artist, but a tenured professor at a very, very good university. He no longer thinks that that kind of transition will be possible. And this, ironically, is the direct result of, or it's one of the direct results of the success in democratization. So democratization has fragmented the audience, that's one thing. But also, money is going somewhere else. So the irony of this, if I'm not mistaken, is that we're going to see fewer and fewer people studying art. Fewer and fewer people will be able to regard art as in some way a necessary part of their lives. It will be once again regarded as a luxury for the rich. And so if that happens, my suggestion is that if that happens, it goes along with other profound social and political changes. Yes. Chris. Sorry, Chris and then Elisha. Thank you. Yes. Right. Right. So Chris is asking me to think about those moments in the classroom where there is resistance to dialogical practice. Yes, and then some. Right? Think about this. The way I think about this is when you learn about Freudian psychoanalysis, the fundamental method of which is called the free association, that you must learn. You, on the couch or in the therapist's room, must learn to speak the first thing that comes into your mind without censorship. The first time many people experience this, they just shut up, right? They have nothing to say. So here is the irony, and it's an irony of which the Surrealist movement, who also valued spontaneity that they called automatism, were aware of. Think about this irony, that you have to learn to be spontaneous, right? One has to learn to be spontaneous. Well, what is arguably the primal act of spontaneity available to human beings? Speech, conversation, right? So the classroom is precisely an environment where certain resistances from outside are brought. And part of one's job as a participant in a dialogue is to try and address. That is why it has to be reflexive. That is why we're not simply teaching content, right? One has to be reflexive because one has to learn, okay? And if one doesn't regard that as absurdly paradoxical, I would say that's the reason that we see these resistances, because often students are coming with a whole host of unexamined assumptions about what it is to learn. They're coming with the effects of certain social damages. as well. And we are not giving time within the dialogical situation to try and activate a new way of learning where, as it were, it's not le maître, it's not the master, but somebody who is in a position of co-authorship, of co-learning. Not everything will be amenable to that model, but I do think that that is what we need to think about. That is to say, part of learning now needs to be learning to learn. And that means an examination of resistances. I mean, does that touch on... It is a bottomless topic, yes. Elisha. Thank you. Thank you. Say that again. Yes. Yes. It's not first. It's an important observation that facilitates my argument that because fundamentally, as this relates to our practice in Detroit, I'm saying we need to look at what's going on in the city where hardly any of those artists are part of teaching institutions. Greg Fadell, who is sitting here, has an exhibition, a wonderful exhibition just behind this wall. I can point to many other people. I mean, John Corbin is an adjunct, but he's not teaching art. There are lots and lots of people, and there are other people, furthermore, for whom, as I keep saying, these are works of James Lee Byers, and I wanted, come on, Michael E. Smith, and there is another version of this talk that just concentrates on the slides, and one of the things that I've been interested in, I raised this question, Jeffrey, when you gave your talk, is James Lee Byers a Detroit artist, or an artist who happens to come from Detroit? And I've begun to think that one of the ways we might be able to answer this question is to look at artists such as Mike Smith, for instance, from Detroit, who have been influenced by Byers, entered into dialogue, and through that, someone like Kevin Beasley. But when I go through, there's two more, I think. Kevin Beasley, he was in fine arts, painter at CCS, but by the time he was graduating, he'd already begun to, and I think a key moment talking about transference, the model of transference, Kevin Beasley became Kevin Beasley because of his relationship to Mike Smith. This was the person who showed him what a certain type of object making could be. And by the time he was graduating from CCS, he was moving way beyond painting into that very 60s phenomenon, the hinterland between painting and sculpture. He may well be on the verge of becoming better known for his sound work than for his quote-unquote art making of his objects. This is from the year he graduates from Yale. He's curated into a performance at MoMA in New York. Starting next month, he has a major exhibition at the Dallas Museum of Fine Arts of his sound work. Nobody taught Kevin Beasley sound work at CCS. Nobody, right? This is something he had to learn from somewhere else, and it's fairly easy to track how he does that. But Kevin is not going to be teaching. Bieber Bell and Friends, the modern garage movement, another one of the major post-studio practitioners in Detroit, in this case to do with dance. I want to relate some of this to Scott Hocking making objects in places where nobody may ever get to see the objects. Dance in places that very few people may be able to go and see. But these ideas and the pedagogies behind them, Bieber's just finished a PhD in performance studies and performance history. These ideas are being worked out within the city. George Tish has just written an article for the next issue of Detroit Research that addresses specifically the dimension of self-learning on the part of the artist's workshop in Detroit. I'm saying these are communities of learning that may be models for us, and almost none of them are being pursued within the framework of the art school. Mitch and Gina, time for bold ideas to shape the future of Detroit. I'm saying that those bold ideas are taking place in the city, right? Yes, institutions like my own Wayne State, the foundations are helping to shape in monetary ways, in cultural ways, and this is absolutely essential. But when we look at the art, it's happening in the city. Of course, we all know the Heidelberg project, and one of the things that I am interested in is a particular variant of social practice in Detroit that emphasizes play and playfulness. It's everywhere. This is a mural for Grace Lee Boggs. It's just around the corner in Midtown. Wonderful, a statement from Grace Lee Boggs says, today we need to combine learning with work, political struggle, community service, and even play, right? And even play, where play, in fact, is a spiritual need. It's not a luxury. It's not a luxury. And the principal institutional version we have of play is art, right? Art is the principal institutional version. And I find this to be very strong in Detroit. The Rydit Sculpture Park that is part of the Powerhouse Productions. I don't know if Greg has any thoughts on this as a former skateboarder, or maybe still. Pops Packing, Graham White and Faina Lerman. This is an example of their practice, fields of play. And I think there's one more example in terms of post-studio art, Scott Hocking, The Egg from the Michigan Central Station, which I think is just a phenomenal work. And not many people got to see that. Not many people got to see that. Most people will see it as a photographic image, or, I hope, on the front cover of Detroit Research, Volume 1. But Scott is somebody who does deep anthropological, archaeological, and historical research that informs his practice. And the last image I want to refer to here, Susan Gertle Campbell, who is originally trained as a printmaker. But her work is not about print making, not in any ordinary sense. I think her work is to do with the logic of the imprint, but it's not really about traditional printmaking. And this is a 3-hour video that she made of weather patterns from the Fisher Building. She did this project of leaving a camera on the Fisher Building for over a year, and then edited it down to just over 3 hours. Susan is somebody who does very deep research, scientific research that informs her art-making practice. Every one of these people has a reputation not only in Detroit, but significantly outside Detroit. Every one of them. But that is what is not represented. So I'm basically making the argument that if we want to talk about changes in pedagogy that might be part of an art school of the future, this is where we need to go. So I'm not advocating a particular style of art, but I'm advocating for certain types of practices that are prevalent in the community and, to the best of my knowledge, are not significantly represented within the local art school system. That is the claim, and I'm open to being contradicted. Corinna. Yes. Yes. I made an argument that is partly a standard art historical argument that the frame is one of the distinctive features of Western art. And it's only when the frame becomes implicitly part of the logic of Western art that the question of what is or is not outside the frame can be posed. So Duchamp's urinal could not have happened in any culture that didn't have the frame. Because there is no, if there was no frame, it wouldn't occur to you to be able to say, this may or may not be art. Because, by the way, there is no evidence that Duchamp actually said that it was a work of art. There's none whatsoever. But the set of plays, conceptual plays that are set in place by Duchamp submitting this to the Armory show, and which, by the way, I think, as most of you know, only exists as a photograph. Nobody knows what happened, supposed to the so-called original. The set of conceptual plays would only be possible in a culture that had the concept of the frame both as a physical thing, an aesthetic phenomenon, and a conceptual phenomenon. So the conceptual phenomenon here would be the processes by which we learn to recognize what belongs to the frame, even when it's not a physical frame, i.e. the gallery, the art school, the museum. Hence my example, no one needs to be, who chanced upon Rembrandt's Self-Portrait in the middle of the road would need to be told that that was a painting. But a comparable person chancing upon the urinal in the middle of the road who didn't know that already, it would not occur to them that that was a work of art. In other words, because they would not be able to see the frame. And so I think the frame, much of what challenges art now, is simply part of the logic of the frame. It just follows from the fact that we have the frame. No. The book, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed from 1969, has come back in contemporary art theory from those people who are interested in social practice. And so the idea there is that the oppressed, it's a model of teaching that says, I have something to give you, I am active teacher, you are passive. So I said, drop the word oppressed, put in the word student, right? And this characterizes the traditional model of teaching, what Paulo Freire called the banking method, i.e. you deposit money, you deposit knowledge. And he's saying we need to become liberated from that, and the student needs to become liberated from that so that we can enter a relationship of co-authorship and co-learning.